Welcome, everyone is coming in. Give them a few seconds to come in here. People will continue joining, but I want to say welcome. My name's David Swanson. I'm a co-founder and executive director at World Beyond War, which is hosting this webinar and is very proud to do so. This is being recorded. There will be a video. It will be on YouTube and on the World Beyond War website. I will say that repeatedly in the chat as everyone continues to ask. Yes, it will be recorded. There will be resources and the recorded video sent to everyone by email following the webinar. This will be a 90-minute program. It will be moderated by Tamara Lorincz, who will introduce each of these wonderful speakers. And there is captioning if you want to use it. Please understand it's done by a robot and there are lots of mistakes. And please put your questions throughout the course of the program into the chat, and I will sort through them and ask them of our terrific speakers at the end. There will also be announcements at the very end of upcoming events and other matters of interest. With that, I'd like to turn it over to the great Tamara Lorincz.
Thank you so much, David, and welcome everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. It's so great that we have people joining us from around the world. We have a really important webinar today. From Gaza and Ukraine to World War III, the NATO problem. NATO is the problem, and we really need to mobilize and work together to call for its abolition. So my name is Tamara Lorincz. I am a member of the Canadian Voice of Women for Peace and the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom Canada. I am also a member of the International Coordinating Committee of the No to War, No to NATO network, and I'm also involved in the Global Women United Against NATO. And I'm going to put a link in the chat for these organizations, and we encourage people to get involved. So we are hosting this important webinar. It's being organized by the great World Beyond War and the International Peace Bureau, and supported by organizations from around the world who understand the threat that NATO poses to global peace and security. We are hosting this webinar in the lead up to the 75th anniversary of NATO that will be taking place in Washington, D.C. in July. We are hosting a really important counter summit. There is going to be a No to NATO, Yes to Peace and Cooperation Summit and Rally on July 6th and 7th. Information about that really important event will be in the chat, and we are hoping people can join us in Washington, D.C. or do an action where you are against NATO. So just to quickly say that 2 years ago in an interview, the former president of Bolivia, Evo Morales, said in an interview that NATO poses the greatest threat to world peace and security, and we couldn't agree with him more. In the post-Cold War period, these past 30 years, we have just seen chaos, instability, and wars from NATO, from the illegal bombing in Yugoslavia in 1999 to the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and Syria and Libya and in Ukraine, and there's the connection to Gaza as well. NATO is adversely fomenting and exacerbating all of these conflicts, including the climate crisis. And this is what we're going to hear from our great lineup of speakers today. So I'm very pleased to be introducing the very first speaker, Shireen Jurdi from Lebanon. She is an amazing, accomplished activist, and I had the great privilege to be with her at COP28 in Dubai, the climate summit last year. She has almost 20 years of experience working in the field of peace building and conflict prevention. She led the establishment of the MENA Coalition on Youth, Peace and Security. Since 2003, Jurdi has been Shireen has been a member of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, and she was recently elected the president of WWIII Lebanon, so it's fantastic. She is also a member of the International Board of Control Arms Coalition and on the steering committee of the Arab States Feminist Network. She was awarded the International Young Women's Peace and Human Rights Award from Democracy Today, and she holds an ABD in Peace and Conflict Studies from Tokyo University of Foreign Studies. So Shireen, it's so wonderful to have you join us. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Tamara. I wish to begin by thanking the organizers for this webinar and Tamara for moderating. Thank you, World Beyond War. Thank you to NATO, Yes to Peace, for bringing us together at a critical moment when militarization and conflict are on the rise. I'm speaking to you from Lebanon, around 100 kilometers, where white phosphorus weapons are being shelled in the south of Lebanon. Today is the eve of the Adha feast. Let me begin by wishing everyone a happy Eid, where permanent peace can be achieved and maintained. And this is where the importance of our webinar also had. I'd like to express my appreciation to all of you to raise our voice at a time where double standards and lack of human rights and justice parameters are unprecedented. I want to divide my talk on the implicit and explicit impacts of NATO and militarization power, with USA taking the lead in military power, feeding into a political hegemony. War cannot be sustained without the supply of weapons. And this is a point that I want to push forward. I want also to bring the linkages between militarization, the veto power, the dehumanization of Palestinians, the dehumanization of the South in general, to the climate change, feminism, feminist foreign policy. And above all, I would like also to shed light on frameworks and tools that we can use into this campaign that we are having for us as grassroots to have in terms of lobbying and advocating our governments and civil society to work within frameworks, within international frameworks, mainly the Arms Trade Treaty. Just for us all to be on the same side, it's very important to know that it did not start on October 7. Gaza is one of the world's most densely populated places. A narrow strip of land, only 141 square miles. It is the home of 2.1 million Palestinians, 81% of whom are refugees. In addition to humanitarian and political crisis created by multiple years of recurring conflict, Gaza's water, soil, and air have been devastated, and reconstruction will add to the carbon emissions that I will be mentioning soon. Israel is a major non-NATO ally. The USA is the largest provider for Israel's foreign-sourced weapons, amounting to 68%. USA spends around $3.8 billion annual in military help to Israel, with a 10-year agreement to allow for a qualitative military edge, where Israel needs to be superior even in military to its neighboring countries. USA enabled Israel to develop its own armament industry, where Israel is now one of the world's top arms exporters. We have witnessed in the present genocide that is committed in Gaza, that Israel is using also artificial intelligence against Palestinians in what is automated murder. And this model will be studied and copied by other nations. And this is why many nations are supporting Israel and allowing them to buy these battle-tested weapons. And this is where it becomes a collective responsibility and a collective also knowledge for us to see that it's not only happening in Gaza, and it will not only happen in our part of the world, but this kind of technology will be widespread as we silence and are silenced against such kind of weapons usage. Surveillance technology developed in Israel also has been sold to the USA in the form of watchtowers now used on the border with Mexico. The EU's border agency, Frontex, is known to have used Israeli drone technology to monitor refugees. So this is just to see that it's a holistic picture of the usage of weapons with the support that Israel has as a non-ally NATO power. Just the first 2 months of the war in Gaza, we have seen more annual carbon footprint of more than 20 of the world's most climate vulnerable nations. The climate cost of the first 60 days of Israel's military response was equivalent to burning at least 150,000 tons of coal. And now, if we want to think about rebuilding Gaza after Israel's bombardment, will come at an environmental cost of 60 million tons of CO2 equivalent, according to a new research. So I will take the opportunity, because I know lots of my colleagues in here will be talking about NATO, what NATO is doing to not only to MENA, to Gaza, to Lebanon, but also to the world. I want to look at just as we see our world and how we are and how it is functioning. We want to see also what are the mechanisms that we need to carry out in the coming few days and also in the coming month in the activism that will be held in July. In Gaza, we have witnessed more than 8 months of relentless Israeli attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure, including the use of starvation as a weapon of war. The International Court of Justice has ruled it plausible that this could amount to genocide. All states have an obligation to prevent atrocities. In these circumstances, the Arms Trade Treaty is clear. Any transfer of weapons, ammunition, parts, and components that are at risk of being used in Gaza is likely to violate international humanitarian law and therefore must cease immediately. Even for states that have not joined the ATT, they still have obligations under international customary law, which includes countries such as the United States, which is leading the NATO countries to forge Geneva Conventions and customary international law obligates all states to ensure respect for international humanitarian law. By ending their supply of items that are at risk of being used in the conflict, military arms exporting states can help in bringing an end to serious violations of international humanitarian law and, most importantly, to the suffering being witnessed in places such as Gaza, Haiti, Myanmar, and Sudan. It is only being part of activists and NGOs that we can influence how states, parties, whether party to the ATT or not, how we can able to develop these mechanisms and have them in place. 40% of the total international trade conventional weapons take place under the ATT. This means that 40% of international trade is subject to the ATT risk assessment. Currently, there are 113 state parties to the ATT, but this number is growing. Disappointedly, there are only 3 state parties to the ATT and from MENA. I want to highlight Article 6 and 7 from of the ATT, and for us also to take note of and know exactly, once we lobby and once we see our country sending weapons to conflict zone, how we hold them accountable on one hand, and how also we stop sending these weapons to conflict area. In Article 6, Article 6.1 prohibits transfers that would violate measures adopted by the UN Security Council acting under Chapter 7, in particular arms embargoes. Article 6.2 prohibits transfers that would be in violation of obligations under international agreements to which ATT states parties belong, for example, the Firearm Protocol. Article 6.3 prohibits transfers by state party. It has knowledge at the time of the authorization that the weapon would be used in the commission of genocide and crimes against humanity. Not only that, in Article 7, and especially Article 7.5, asks for assessment whether these weapons would be used in crimes against humanity or against gender-based violence or against sexual-based violence. So just for us to take all these components of these ATT while we are also advocating away from the hegemony that these NATO states and non-NATO states are having towards ATT. and our world of injustice that we are living. I want to add a few more points. If we remember, since the war on Gaza, the vetoing of ceasefire and how the USA was leading on, how can we veto a ceasefire at the Security Council? How can we stop humanitarian support to people who are encraved and who are under occupation, who have nothing to hold to? Last point I want to shed light in here is the issue of feminist foreign policy and the women, peace and security agenda, to say and to see that we cannot work in silos. Once we talk about NATO or any other kind of alliances that are putting human suffering up front and like looking at the misery of the people and what kind of misery and suffering the people are suffering of, we need to see how, for example, the German feminist foreign policy is contributing, as Germany is one of the NATO countries, how the feminist foreign policy is contributing to stopping this sending weapons to conflict areas. And this is raising questions on accountability and transparency of such kind of policies, how the women, peace and security agendas from these NATO countries are actually looking at sending weapons to places where more than 70% of the victims are women and children in Gaza. And as well, what is happening now in Lebanon in terms of phosphorus weapons, and Lebanon actually raised a case also against Israel due to the usage of the phosphorus weapon. So just in a nutshell, we are living in an injustice world where these alliances, unfortunately, taking the lead with militarization, with all these resources that are spent in militarization, destruction, climate destruction, and emissions that will be causing hundreds of years for the soil, the air, and the water to be done and to be brought back to what needs to be done. And at the same time, how is it that we can work against such ingredients towards a human security, where we have a human security approach towards the resources that we have and toward the processes of these resources and how they are to be used. We have seen during COVID how even these NATO countries were unable to provide their citizens with a decent health security. So maybe it's time for us as citizens of the world, as people from the grassroots, as people who work in peace organizations, to say no to these resources that are spent on destruction. Last, I want to say, and I encourage everybody in the room and who will be watching this video to support the ATT processes. We are going to have the 10th anniversary of the ATT in August. Let our countries speak about the armament processes and how the armament are actually not only not bringing the Paris Agreement, but also how the world is deteriorating in terms of our justice, our dignity, and our humanitarian support. Peace to Gaza, peace to Lebanon, peace to the world, and thank you all for being so attentive. Back to you, Tamara.
Thank you so much, Shireen, for your excellent presentation. And as you were speaking, I was thinking about the fact that one of the very first things that the Israeli government did after October 7th was have a call with NATO and to coordinate with the NATO allies on weapons shipment to Israel. And it's all of these NATO countries, including Canada, that are violating the Arms Trade Treaty and the Women, Peace and Security agenda by continuing to send weapons to Israel and are very much complicit in this horrendous genocide that we're seeing in Gaza. And just to remind everybody on the call, in 2016, Israel actually established an office at the NATO headquarters in Brussels, and the NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg has said many times that Israel remains a vital partner to NATO in the Middle East. So thank you again, Shireen. And now we are going to move to our next speaker, and this is the formidable Medea Benjamin, who is the co-founder of Code Pink and the Fair Trade Advocacy Group, Global Exchange. She is the co-author of the new book with David Swanson entitled NATO, What You Need to Know. I encourage everybody to get a copy and to share it with their friends and family. Medea's also co-authored the really important book as well, War in Ukraine, Making Sense of a Senseless War, among many other books and articles. In 2012, she was awarded the U.S. Peace Memorial Foundation's Peace Prize. She's also the recipient of the 2014 Gandhi Peace Award, and in 2010, the Martin Luther King Jr. Peace Prize from the Fellowship of Reconciliation. And Medea is also on the board of World Beyond War. So Medea, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be on with this great group of speakers. And I'm so glad, Shireen, that we've started with Gaza because it is such an incredible tragedy. And watching as most of the world does nothing to stop this is just so heartbreaking. It's also such a scary time for the world and for us here in the United States, where we're in the throes now of an election process that is moving forward with two candidates that the majority of people in the United States do not want, and are both war candidates. We have Biden, who is supporting a genocide, and can you ever vote for anybody who has overseen and given the green light for a genocide? And we have Trump, who we have seen in the 4 years he was there, the erratic nature of his foreign policy. And particularly when it comes to Israel, how supportive he has been of Israeli government oppression of the Palestinians. It puts us in a very difficult position. And as we're talking about the possibilities of World War III, we see it on three different fronts. We see it on in Israel with the potential of this war spinning out into a regional conflict, certainly on the border of Lebanon right now. It's about to blow up even more than it has. We see the issue of Ukraine, and with the okay now of the US and other governments to use US weapons to strike into Russia, the potential of that spinning out into a regional war and potentially a nuclear war. And then we see the Western countries, the US especially, and with the support of NATO, wanting for a long time to pivot to China and the potential of a war in the Indo-Pacific. So it is a very scary time for the world. And as I said, for those in the United States, not seeing any potential of electing anybody who wants to do anything differently when it comes to war making. And the support for NATO is rock solid in the US. And I would say in some part because the American public knows so little about NATO. And that's why NATO being hosted in the United States in Washington, D.C. In July is such an important moment for us to educate people about how pernicious NATO is, how NATO is so important in keeping all these wars going, and its connection to the military-industrial complex and the billions of dollars that the weapons companies make from these wars. So thank you so much to World Beyond War for its efforts to educate people. And David Swanson and I got to write a book together that really outlines all of the ways that NATO is involved in war making. Shireen brought up a lot of the issues in the case of Israel, and you added to that, Tamara. I just want to add a couple of things of saying how Israel has pushed for the U.S. not to be in a nuclear agreement with Iran, in fact, has pushed for war with Iran, and how NATO falls right into that as well, with NATO saying that Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran are all enemies and have come together as enemies of freedom and democracy, and how NATO must stand up against Iran, with Stoltenberg saying we must use economic, legal, political sanctions and credible military deterrence. While there is some division in Europe, and I think positive that there are more divisions in Europe around how to deal with the the slaughter that's going on in Israel, with some of the countries like Spain, Belgium, Ireland, and Slovenia taking a more pro-Palestinian position, and countries like Austria, Czech Republic, Hungary, and Germany being with the United States in its, quote, rock solid support for Israel. NATO tries to paper over all of that and have NATO be a solid supporter for Israel in this moment of genocide, and taking over the role of European governments when it comes to their policies towards Israel. In the case of Ukraine, we know, and I'll leave it to Yuri and Jeffrey to talk about more of NATO's involvement in creating the conditions that led to the war in Ukraine. But I think it's so important to recognize that right now, when Ukraine is so desperately needs a real peace process, we see a fake peace process going forward with this meeting taking place in Switzerland, with so many countries involved except Russia not invited. And you see Putin putting forward a call for peace talks, although he says that he's ready for peace with Ukraine if Ukraine withdraws from 4 regions that Russia annexed in 2022 and doesn't even control now, and if Ukraine renounces membership in NATO. This is more like a beginning position for peace talks than a realistic one. But instead of saying that this is a start and let's get the parties together, what we have is NATO and, of course, the United States constantly stymieing and sabotaging any real peace talks. You have Stoltenberg, who I love how David Swanson is always saying, never elected by anybody, coming forward and publicly rejecting Putin's offer, saying that Putin's offer was not made in good faith. Maybe it wasn't, but it's not up to Stoltenberg to say that. And meanwhile, NATO just had its 2-day meeting leading up to this July summit, where it wants to lock in indefinitely NATO support for Ukraine by calling for this long-term training and military aid coordination at a U.S. base in Germany. They're saying that there are going to be about 700 staff of this, and it was actually said that this is to Trump-proof the future of U.S. support, because they are concerned that when Trump comes in, there will not be the same kind of support for continuing the war in NATO. And Stoltenberg wants NATO to agree to $43 billion a year in equipment to Ukraine indefinitely. This is on top of a loan that was just announced by the G7 of $50 billion. Of course, they say it will be used with, it will be refunded with profits from Russian assets. But there's nothing to say that that is really the case. It is more money coming from the coffers of taxpayers in the US and the European countries. And I want to end by quoting a ridiculous thing that Stoltenberg just said when he said why NATO should lock in its ongoing support for Ukraine. He said, the paradox is that the longer we plan and the longer we commit, the sooner Ukraine will have peace. Shows the absurdity of the NATO support for ongoing war in Ukraine, instead of pushing NATO aside and going forward with what is really needed, which is peace talks. He also said that it is important to bring Ukraine closer to NATO membership when it's the threat of NATO membership that was one of the reasons for this war in the first place. So thank you for the time and for the efforts that World Beyond War is making to educate people about the dangers of NATO and why it should not be expanded and fortified as it is being right now, but it should be dissolved. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Medea, for your excellent presentation. And you're absolutely right. These are very scary, dangerous times. And it is NATO that is driving this militarism, this increase to military spending, this military industrial complex, and these wars. And as you were speaking, I was thinking to myself that NATO is just a military alliance dominated and dictated by the United States, just 32 members, but the rest of the world, the global majority, 160 countries are outside of NATO, and they don't want this anymore. And we do need at this time loud, courageous voices for peace. And Medea has been that, Shireen has been that, and our next speaker has also used his important platforms to call for peace. So I'm very pleased to be welcoming Dr. Jeffrey Sachs, a world-renowned economist, a professor at Columbia University, best-selling author, global leader in sustainable development, and he is the director of the Center for Sustainable Development at Columbia University. For almost 20 years, Dr. Sachs served as a special advisor to the United Nations Secretary Generals, and he's got an excellent website, jeffsachs.org, and I would encourage you to get onto his mailing list. Dr. Sachs, please go ahead.
Tamara, thank you very much, and thanks to everybody for joining in such an important discussion. Urgent, timely, and absolutely capable of producing some important results. I want to step back to understand a little bit of the history of NATO and what has gone so completely, disastrously, totally wrong. NATO was the 70s a defense of a Soviet invasion. A plausibility, although I would add, and I'm not going to go into length, there were other ways to end the Cold War, even then in 1949, certainly in the 1950s, through negotiation, not through this kind of alliance structure. But be that as it may, NATO was essentially an organization led by the United States that put a U.S. military presence in Western Europe during the Cold War period, ostensibly to defend Western Europe against a possible conventional force invasion by the Soviet Union. In the late 1980s, Mikhail Gorbachev, a great statesman and somebody that I had the great honor to advise as an economic advisor more than 35 years ago, said, we don't need this balance of terror in Europe. We, the Soviet Union, will unilaterally disband the Warsaw Pact military alliance of the Central and Eastern European countries with the Soviet Union. And we will actually, and I know it for a fact because I was there and I watched it, we will help the democratization of Central and Eastern Europe, more even that. And in 1990, the United States wisely said to Gorbachev, we understand, and this is crucial. It is for our global security. We commit not to move NATO 1 inch eastward. And people should look at something called the National Security Archive online, National Security Archive of George Washington University, for all of the documentary archival materials showing this clear, explicit, repeated commitment to not move NATO 1 inch eastward. In fact, NATO should have been ended in 1990. The Warsaw Pact was ended. NATO should have been ended. The purpose was over. There was going to be no Soviet invasion of Western Europe. And the military means for that were disbanded. We should have disbanded NATO. But we certainly should have honored a very clear, explicit promise to President Gorbachev and to President Yeltsin, whom I also advised in the early 1990s. But the United States cheated. NATO was seen not as a defensive organization, but as an expeditionary army for the United States and for the new aim of the United States starting in 1992, global hegemony. This is explicit. This isn't just a rhetorical statement. The defense secretary at the time, Richard Cheney, said, now the United States can run the world. The Project for the New American Century, which was formed by the so-called neoconservatives, said, now the US really does run the world. It's the sole superpower. It's the indispensable country, a phrase that Joe Biden uses. And he is certainly a warmonger, relentlessly, and has been throughout his entire career. Impossible to vote for him, in my opinion. So NATO became something rather explicit, an instrument of US power expansion. Not only did the US cheat and start expanding NATO eastward, it actually laid out a plan to expand NATO not only to Central Europe, which was the first wave under Clinton, who first broke the promise to Hungary, Poland, and the Czech Republic, but eastward to surround Russia. And not only surround Russia, the goal of these neocons, as delusional and dangerous as it sounds, was to dismember Russia, something that Cheney already broached in 1992. So there have been 14 countries in Central Europe, Eastern Europe, and the former Soviet Union that have joined NATO since the promise not 1 inch eastward. This is a dirty swindle, but it's also a threat to the entire world. It's why we have the Ukraine war. Because as the Russians explained repeatedly, don't keep advancing your military alliance to our border. And they heard, they're not naive, how Americans talked about not only surrounding Russia, not only surrounding Russia's naval fleet in Sevastopol and Crimea with Ukraine, Romania, Bulgaria, Turkey, and Georgia, but dismantling Russia. And so, as Zbig Brzezinski laid out in a 1997 article you can also find online called A Strategy for Eurasia, Russia wasn't naive. It said, stop coming to our border. Then the United States walked out of the anti-ballistic missile treaty unilaterally in 2002. It started to place missiles nearby Russia, starting with Poland and Romania, with the placement of the Aegis missiles. Then the United States overthrew the government of Ukraine in February 2014, together with Ukrainian extremist forces, recognized a new coup-installed government immediately in one day. The United States didn't try to defend the constitutional order because it was part of the process of illegal regime change. And it announced, now we move NATO to Russia's border. And Russia has repeatedly said, stop, no, don't do it. And even our current CIA director, William Burns, who in 2008 was the US ambassador to Russia, wrote a secret memo, a long message back to Condoleezza Rice, Secretary of State. Don't try it. The entire Russian political class views this as the reddest of red lines. How do we know about such a secret memo? Since our government operates on secrecy and doesn't let the American people in on these fateful decisions, because it was leaked and it showed up in WikiLeaks. So you can look online. William Burns, 2008. The memo is called "Niet means Niet," and he was explaining the red line of Russia. Well, these neocons have pushed us to the brink of nuclear war, and it's bipartisan, by the way. It's been Clinton with the NATO enlargement. It's been George W. Bush Jr. It was Obama overthrowing governments, trying to overthrow the Syrian government by tasking the CIA to overthrow Bashar al-Assad, using NATO to overthrow the Libyan government, and sending Victoria Nuland, who was the Deputy National Security Advisor of none other than Richard Cheney, to Kiev to be the point person in the overthrow of Yanukovych in February 2014, when Nuland was the Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs. It is Biden today because he was part of this for 30 years. He's been a promoter of the military-industrial complex. He's been a promoter of all of these wars of choice. He has been a promoter of NATO enlargement to Ukraine, despite every red line that Russia has put down. And he has rejected negotiations at every single moment. And let me say a word about what President Putin said a couple of days ago. You can find the speech of President Putin online. It's completely a plausible basis for negotiation. It is not so utterly in good faith. It is the same that Russia has been saying in its leadership for 2 decades, which is no NATO enlargement. Stop. That's what Putin is saying. That has been the essence of the Ukraine conflict. Don't overthrow the government in Ukraine to install NATO. Don't press for NATO membership. Don't bomb us with NATO weapons. And Putin is saying, stop the NATO enlargement. Zbig Brzezinski used an idea of Lord Palmerston from the Crimean War of 1853 to 1856 to surround the Russian fleet in Crimea. Putin says, no, Crimea is not going to be part of NATO. Now, there are things to negotiate, but as Medea said, that's what negotiations are about. But Biden is a failure. He immediately rejected negotiations. And we know that the US and UK torpedoed the negotiations that were likely to bring a peace agreement. It's now covered even in the New York Times, of all places, to bring a peace agreement between Russia and Ukraine in March 2022. And Biden torpedoed that as well, because these neocons want to put NATO everywhere. These neocons think they're playing the game of Risk, but they're playing with our lives, and they have been playing with Ukraine's lives, because since the time that the US torpedoed the very fruitful negotiations underway between Russia and Ukraine in March 2022, 500,000 Ukrainians have died on the battlefield because the US didn't want to negotiate. Now Biden's telling us, again, don't negotiate. So understand, NATO is the expeditionary force of the neocons for US hegemony. It is a threat to world peace. It is the obstacle to sensible negotiations. Let me just add to Shireen, this horrendous genocidal war of Israel in Gaza also should end in a day, because Gaza and the occupied territories of the West Bank and East Jerusalem should be a sovereign Palestinian state, the 194th member state of the United Nations, and the US alone vetoed that in April. The whole world wants it, but the US vetoes it. So what we're seeing is extraordinary, delusional, hubristic arrogance of the United States. It's warmongering. They got into their heads 30 years ago that the US should run the world. It was fantasy, but it has brought us to the brink of world war. And it is the green light to genocidal war of Israel in Gaza against the Palestinian people. It is the bloodshed that the US is shedding of Ukrainian blood, as they say, fight to the last Ukrainian. And it is provoking, and we're very close to a war with China. Unimaginable stupidity to even think in these terms. So what we're really up against is the need for a fundamental change of US foreign policy to stop the militarism, to end these wars, to stop trying to run the world. Now, I'm supporting Jill Stein, by the way. She is our only peace candidate on the ballot across the United States. I can't imagine voting for Biden. Just as Medea said, you cannot vote for someone who supports a genocide. I cannot imagine voting for Donald Trump. This is, don't even get me started. We need candidates of peace, and we need to be supporting peace in every way. And so let me thank all of you and thank the world beyond war. We could have it. We could settle these wars at the negotiating table very quickly if the United States would drop its delusions of hegemonic control and pretending or trying to run the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Sachs. That was excellent. We put a link in the chat for the National Security Archives, What Gorbachev Heard. I also want to mention that I was at the Clinton Presidential Library last October, and I went through the archives. I saw, private and public. These are non-digitized records that showed very clearly for the past 30 years, the Russians have been saying no NATO expansion, and we don't want any further expansion in Europe. We don't want expansion of NATO in Asia or Latin America, anywhere. We need to call for its dissolution.
Tamara, could
yes.
I ask you also to link to something called What Yeltsin Heard, because there's another archival file in the same website for a little bit later.
Okay, perfect. We will do that. Thank you for flagging
Thanks,
that
everybody.
for us. Thank you so much, Dr. Sachs, for everything that you're doing, speaking out for peace. We need everyone's voices. Thank you so much. So our next speaker is Oleg Bodrov, and I was so happy to be able to meet with him in person in his hometown of St. Petersburg, Russia, a year and a half ago, November of 2022. I encourage everyone to go and meet with Oleg in St. Petersburg. So he is an engineer, physicist, environmentalist, former member of the Council of International Peace Bureau, and the chairman of the Public Council of the South Coast of the Gulf of Finland in St. Petersburg. Oleg is one of the leaders of the Russian peace, environmental protection, and nuclear safety movements. In coalition with partners from the Baltic Sea countries, he is working to reduce the level of confrontation between NATO and Russia in the Baltic. He is the author of reports at international anti-war conferences in Helsinki, Paris, New York, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and you forgot to include Vienna, where we saw each other last year in person. And he is the creator of documentaries on the consequences of nuclear weapons production and nuclear energy. Oleg, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Tamara. And first of all, I'd like to say thank you so much because it's important to discuss all aspects of the NATO-Russia confrontation. And today I'd like to discuss one specific problem, and I need to use demonstration of the screen. Now I will show some slides. Just a moment. So, dear colleagues, first of all, thank you, Tamara, that I'd like to repeat. I am physicist and ecologist. Many years I worked with the Soviet and Russian nuclear industry. I was a researcher of the nuclear safety for nuclear submarine reactors. Later, I studied the consequences of nuclear complex near St. Petersburg on the Baltic Sea environment. I visited Chernobyl accident area, as well as area of the Fukushima nuclear power plant. So for the last 30 years, I have been involved to the international environmental and peace movement. This experience allowed me to formulate two theses. First, nuclear power plant have become a new type of the radiological weapons of mass destruction. And second, in the atomic world, it is impossible to win with the help of the weapons. I will briefly justify the first thesis.
Excuse me, Oleg, sorry to interrupt you, but it might be helpful for you to use full screen for your presentation mode for your presentation, for your slides.
I use full screen, yes? Do you see my slide?
You could put it on presentation mode and show the whole slide, but please carry on. Thank you.
So, as I'd like to compare the influence of the so-called peaceful nuclear technology and military nuclear technology. As a result of the nuclear bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the number of victims 70 years later after the bombing reached 450,000. 20 years after Chernobyl accident on April 26, 1986, additional death increased by 237,000 in Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, and by 40,000 in Europe, in Asia, Africa, and North America by 330,000. Thus, the total number of victims in the Northern Hemisphere, not only in Ukraine, it's reached about 1 million people. This number of victims will grow for several generations. Thus, the number of victims after destroying of the nuclear reactors of the nuclear power plant was 2 times more than after the explosion of 2 bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I'd like to repeat the figures. After the Hiroshima and Nagasaki was 450,000, and after the Chernobyl, 1 million people, victims. So the number after the destruction, the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were reborn in the same place, and hundreds of thousands of people live in them. It will never be possible to live near Chernobyl area. So it is very long time influence to this area. Now, the threats of nuclear power plant destruction can be used as a radiological weapon of mass destruction. These weapons can be used by the countries that do not have nuclear weapons. Any country with the help of the special forces team can take over the nuclear power plant and blackmail the countries.
Sorry, I apologize, Oleg. I'm just wanted to make sure that you're advancing your slides. If you wanted to advance your slides, I'm not sure if you're ready to do that. Just wanted to make sure that they aren't going forward yet. Thank you.
Yeah, do you listen second slide?
We still see just the first slide.
And
yeah.
Only first slide.
Only the first slide, yeah.
And now I changed the slide. Do you have?
No, we don't see the second slide yet.
Okay.
Yeah, there's a little, if you put it in presentation mode, you should be able to, advance the slides a little bit more easily. Thanks.
But now do you listen?
Yes, we see the next slide. Thanks.
Okay. So a bit history. The military has repeatedly attacked research nuclear reactors or energy reactors under construction, as well operating reactors. Israel, Iraq, Iran, the United States, and Russia participated in these operations. After the destruction of the research reactors, there were environmental pollutions. But if we'll destroy the operation reactor or spent fuel storage, it will be much more problems. Just a moment, next slide. For example, I'd like to show you, this is a map of the line of the confrontation between NATO and Russia in the northwest part of the Russia. And this brown line is the line of confrontation from both sides in the western part of the Baltic Sea. And in Russia and Belarus, we have 17 nuclear reactors which is operate now. And in the same time, not less than 20 reactors, spent fuel rods from the 200 reactors, we have in the temporary spent fuel storage. So if this storage or if these reactors will be destroyed during the military conflict, it will be collapse of the style of life, the people who live in the northwest part of the Russia and in the Baltic Sea region, in other countries. Now in 9 countries, there are live 90 million people. So it's illustration that now we have from the left side of this map, from the western part of the Baltic Sea, we have all NATO countries, and from the right side, Russia and Belarus. And now we have increased the confrontation in this area. So it will be very difficult situation if will be destroy the spent fuel rods or spent fuel rod storage or operating nuclear power plants. For example, why did I think so? In Zaporizhia nuclear power plant, it is in Ukraine, which is under control of the Russian military. Now it is six units, 6 reactors, and there are accumulated plutonium-239. The half-life is of the plutonium is 24,000 years, and there are in this nuclear power plant and in the spent fuel rod storage accumulated 750 million lethal dose of plutonium. So if the nuclear power plant will be destroyed, it will be a problem for all Europe. Similar situation in the Baltic region. In the Leningrad nuclear power plant, we have about 1 billion lethal dose of plutonium 239 in the spent fuel rod storage. So usually we discuss the risk of the nuclear weapons, but at the same time, we have much more potential risk from the nuclear power plants, which is continue operation in the zone of the military conflict. And in the same time, I think reasonable to think not only about Baltic Sea, But I think we have a situation when all our Earth is mined by nuclear power plant. So if will be total war, I think it will be not possible to protect nuclear power plants. And if they destroy it, I think it will be total collapse for everybody, for our civilization. And I think we have very well-known in Russia song and a very special, in the end of this song, they have such phrase, let's join hands, friend, so as not to disappear one by one. Thank you so much. I'm finished.
Thank you so much, Oleg. What a beautiful way to end your presentation, reminding us that there are nuclear power plants all over the world, and total war would mean total collapse. And it's so wonderful knowing that you're in St. Petersburg, working to turn the Baltic Sea into a sea of peace. And we also need an independent investigation of the Nord Stream bombing and the environmental damage that it did to the Baltic Sea. So thank you so much, Oleg, for your important presentation. And now it is wonderful to have our final speaker, Yuri Sheliazhenko. He is a PhD now and a member of the board of directors of World Beyond War. He is based in Kyiv, Ukraine. He is the executive secretary of the Ukrainian pacifist movement, a board member of the European Bureau for Conscientious Objection, and a council member of the International Peace Bureau. He is very brave. He obtained a Master's of Mediation and Conflict Management degree in 2021 and a Master's of Law degree in 2016 at Kroc University. In addition to his participation in the peace movement, he's a journalist, a blogger, human rights defender, and legal scholar, and an author of academic publications and a lecturer on legal theory and history. And he has been a facilitator for World Beyond War's online courses, and he is the 2022 International Peace Bureau Sean McBride Peace Prize. Yuri, please go ahead.
Dear friends, greetings from Kyiv. We meet in the days of dangerous escalation of tensions in quickly polarizing world. Rival military strategies and great power alliances on Atlantic and Eurasian space turned global politics into a Gordian knot, or rather a noose on the neck of humankind. So in every country, civil society and peace movements must criticize all armies and all military alliances. If you live in Russia, you must refuse to kill and die for Putin's pleasure in his army waging war of aggression in Ukraine. If you live in China, you must ask your government to treat dissenters more peacefully. If you live in the West, you must advocate restraint in military adventures and ambitions. And so I invite you to protest NATO summit in the United States. No to NATO, yes to peace campaign. For details, please open the website nonatoyespeace.org. I am glad that there will be no NATO at the Global Summit for Peace in Ukraine, which is started today in Switzerland. It is a pity that Putin didn't came there and smeared the event, but he publicly explained his ambitious vision of peace, hardly reconcilable with the UN Charter, but he was hurt. When we are talking peace instead of bloodshed, it is rare in Ukraine and in Russia too, and I am delighted that it is happening now. I hope the peace summit in Switzerland could be a step in right direction. Ukrainian formula of peace proposed by President Zelensky is ambitious too, but it goes in line with the United Nations Charter, and it is based on good commitments to democracy and just peace. So this summit could be a first step for de-escalation or at least prevention of nuclear war. Again, you could criticize particular positions, but it should be always welcomed when people talk about peace instead of usual battle cries. I choose to speak at this webinar despite it could add to criminal charges in justification, so-called justification of Russian aggression, which I am accused, and I am currently facing that it could end in 5 years jail sentence for me. Of course, everybody knows that it is nothing more than a pretext, and my real crime is advocacy of peace and human right to conscientious objection to military service, while Ukrainian army is preparing for never-ending war, advertises a slogan, everybody will fight, and persecutes those who refuse to kill on the grounds of conscience as regular draft evaders. Arbitrary detentions, prisoners of conscience, draconian fines, and deprivation of civil rights for absence of military registration are multiplying. It is a hard choice to remain civilian and even harder choice not to worship army in Ukraine. I must admit that this pretext for my political trial is very appealing for my compatriots, and not without reason. You could not expect sympathy from a victim of aggression hypocritically blamed in provocation of Putin's murderous genocidal assault on our people and our cities. And Ukraine is a victim. Forget the fairy tale that Ukrainians are Nazis because they preferred westernization to historical unity with post-Soviet empire and resisted to Putin's impositions of spheres of influence, openly armed to the teeth and hidden through corruption agents and proxies, similarly like United States divided and ruled Latin America and supported dictators. Ukrainian people, we got rid of Russia-backed dictator. Don't blame us for that. Russian language and culture was indeed curbed too harsh in Ukraine, but not because Ukrainians were Nazis. No, rather because Putin weaponized language and culture as a tool for geopolitical dominance. Of course, he learned from United States and probably also from the Nazi, remember Sudets, how to do that. So when Ukrainian people trust in NATO as a defender helping our nation to survive genocidal aggression, and our mainstream churches, even churches bless NATO, you could imagine how repugnant would be seen for many people here in Ukraine any calls to abolish NATO and stop weapons supply. That's why it is important to avoid any political cliché. Distance from great powers armed to the teeth and align with great powers of truth and love. Think beyond current or past status quo and appeal to imagination, to knowledge of daily peace practices, to hopes and dreams, inspiring enough to cause successful transformative action. Many criticisms of NATO and of Ukrainian politics you take for granted in Ukraine are considered as echoing Russian propaganda, a crime punishable by law, a crime in which I am accused, and again, I could have up to 5 years in jail for it. Similar laws exist or could be adopted in other Western countries. Remember that, and again, avoid toxic cliches useful for one or another belligerent side. Do it to tell truth, not because of fear of prosecution. Fairness is not stopping repressions, but it makes you clear and resilient, and your message is the most effective for common good. In the statement entitled Peace Agenda for Ukraine and the World 2 years ago, we, the Ukrainian pacifist movement, condemned Russian aggression and called to end it by peaceful means. In the result, I faced a preposterous prosecution of a pacifist for alleged apology of war in anti-war statement and a lawsuit threatening to prohibit and dissolve our organization. In the first months after Putin's army brutally invaded my homeland, I gave interview with the title "We Need Nonviolent Global Governance," in which I said pacifists believe that all military alliances, such as North Atlantic Treaty Organization, led by United States, and Collective Security Treaty Organization, led by Russia, are instruments of violent global dominance. They must be disbanded, and the world needs instead non-violent global governance, For example, United Nations, but better organized and well-financed. I said that the world needs comprehensive, inclusive global peace dialogue among peoples and among leaders to resolve overarching conflict between the East and West and derivative conflict between Russia and Ukraine. I was accused in Putin part of responsibility for escalation on the West, and thus allegedly guilty in crime of justification of Russian aggression. This makes no sense, but I have a lot of evidence to prove my innocence at the trial, and still, paradoxically, I see a bit of sense in it, because when we talk about the NATO problem, about imperialism of United States, we forget that others, like Kremlin regime, are happy with copying this imperialism, and they use our criticism of NATO, not because they want the world without NATO as we want, but because they want to be powerful like NATO. Actually, they could be worse than NATO if they manage to beat NATO. Imagine Russian empire dominating Europe, like it was in the past sometimes, dragging its nukes not only to Belarus, but, for example, to Serbia or other countries, targeting the evil United States. Scary, right? And current politics is based on threats and violence. This is a problem. This is wrong. This is a problem bigger than NATO. Indeed bigger. It is all about who will rule the world. We have global information space, the world market, the global languages like mathematics and music. This unites us. This is common good of humankind. We live at common planet, sharing common environment. We need to survive climate change together. And because of that, establishment of global government is a matter of time. Question is whether this global government will be democratic government. NATO pretends to unite democracies, but imposes populist militarism, eroding civil liberties, encouraging witch hunt. Even worse, rivals of NATO pretend absurdly that authoritarian populism is democracy. Future global governance should be free of these mistakes. It must be nonviolent global governance, and its principles are already embodied in the Charter of the United Nations and in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We need to defund all armies and disband all military alliances and fund better the United Nations, organize United Nations better, work harder on social and environmental welfare. We need to make universally known nonviolent methods of resistance to aggressions and tyrannies, like World Beyond War currently launch educational course. We need to learn better unarmed civilian protection. What is wrong with NATO and with rivals of NATO? Wrong too. It is unrealistic vision of peace through strength instead of peace through reason. We fear the enemies too much, and we expect too much security from weapons. It is deadly delusion. It is deadly delusion to expect miracles from nukes, which could kill all life on the planet. We need to put our trust into peaceful dialogue and cooperation instead. And we need to constrain powers of every government to exercise so-called legitimate violence, to restrain power to wage wars. Conscription must be prohibited by international law and condemned by the public. And I invite you to support Object War Campaign and Refuse War Campaign. If not prohibit conscription today, at least defend human right to conscientious objection. We need to expand worldwide peaceful cooperation, not militarism or military alliances, because the fate of humankind, common fate, should be peaceful. United Nations, not NATO, is a hope and better model for global peace. The world without NATO will mean the world without both Atlantic and Eurasian imperialisms. The world where wars are impossible because everybody refuses to kill. The world without armies and borders. Let's hope for such a better world and work together to build happy and peaceful future on our common planet. Love from Kiev.
Thank you, Yuri, for your clarion calls for cooperation and building a nonviolent global governance. And it was just beautiful. It reminded me when I was in Warsaw, Poland a year and a half ago, and I met Ukrainians from both sides of the contact line, and they said, we are brothers. We do not want to fight each other. And we are all brothers and sisters on this planet. And we need to learn to live together in peace. And we can do that by disbanding NATO, but disbanding these military alliances. Demilitarization is so crucial. So I'm now going to turn it over to David, who is going to lead us in the Q&A period. We have about 12 minutes or so for Q&A, and we'll wrap up in the next 15 minutes. David, go ahead.
Thank you, Tamara. Wonderful presentations by all. Unfortunately, Jeffrey Sachs has had to leave. We've got 4 speakers remaining with us. I'm going to try to ask 2 or 3 questions of each in turn. And if you can reply to at least one of them, whatever you can fit in about 3 minutes or less, that would be wonderful. Starting with Shireen, there was a question, why does Lebanon allow Hezbollah? There was also a question, how is a 2-state solution even possible with the state of affairs in the West Bank and Gaza at this point? If you want to take on either or both of those.
Thank you, David, and thanks for those who asked. Actually, remember that Lebanon now does not have the proper funding or the proper armament for the state army. It's not about why we have Hezbollah, it's why we have aggression from Israel. This is the question that needs to be asked. Second, we're talking about sovereignty of the state in Lebanon. I would like to comment on the 2-state solution in Palestine, or the 1-state solution in Palestine. Now, if we talk to any people in Palestinian, they will tell you, we are opt for any kind of solution that can bring permanent peace. If we look at what the divisions from the occupied West Bank, Gaza, Jerusalem, we can see it's a distracted and it's a disconnected places. So definitely, maybe we cannot talk about a 2-state solution. How can we talk about 2-state solution when we have seen that even the water, the electricity that was cut from Gaza were all controlled by the occupier? So just for us to see the infrastructures, to see what is it that we can have in the state for Palestine, what we can opt for is that we can have a solution of a 1-state or a 2-state solution that can bring peace, dignity, justice, and humanization to the Palestinians, where infrastructures are also controlled by the Palestinian authorities. Thank you, David.
Thank you, Shireen. Medea Benjamin, I may overwhelm you here. I think there's about 5 questions. Maybe you can answer 1 or 2 of them. One was, what motivates more nations in joining NATO? One was, why were Bush and Clinton and Bush and Obama and Trump and Biden unwilling to hold NATO to those promises not to expand? One was, what will become of Ukraine? Is it going to be partitioned? Another was, does NATO actually want World War III? Is that the goal of NATO? And yet another I found pretty interesting. How can Germany keep its military small without aligning with the giant US military? Isn't that an anti-military position?
Well, okay, I'll take a couple of them. Motivation to join NATO. Well, you know, it's oftentimes the leaders of countries that want to join NATO, not necessarily the population, although with a lot of propaganda in corporate media like we have in the United States, people are made to believe that NATO is keeping them safer rather than NATO pushing for more war, which makes everybody unsafe. Why are they, the Ukraine, do they want World War III? I think they want the threat of war, which keeps the cycle of war making going and justifies the increased Pentagon budgets in the United States. We're close to $1 trillion now. And so in some ways the threat is enough, but some wars are useful to keep depleting the stocks and be able to then replenish them. And why were they, I'm sorry, the second question.
What will happen with Ukraine? Will it be partitioned?
Oh, what will happen with Ukraine? Well, we can let Yurii speak to that, but I think that it will probably, hopefully, go back to where things were with the peace proposal that came out 1 month after the Russian invasion, which was a 15-point plan, and most of it was about Ukraine accepting neutrality, which is something Zelensky was willing to do at that point, and I think must be willing to do in order for there to be any peace in Ukraine and the region. Thank you.
Thank you, Medea. Let's go to Oleg Bodrov. One question: how close exactly are we to nuclear war? Are we closer than the Cuban Missile Crisis or farther? Then there were a couple themes in the questions, very, very much opposed to each other. One, why should Russia get to decide who joins NATO? It's a free world. Everybody gets to decide for themselves who joins NATO. And the other side of it, what has Russia ever done wrong? Has Russia ever harmed anyone in the whole history of Russia? Hasn't it been a force for good and harmony and love for all?
First of all, I'd like to say that it's reasonable to separate Russian political elite and the Russian population. We have very different vision of the life. Traditionally, Russian government and the Russian political elite it is like two countries, and it is from one hand, and from another hand, we have a nuclear industry, which is they how to say they not under control of the Russian government, because we have special council, which is the persons to this council nominated by Russian president, and this council provide supervisor council of the nuclear industry. So we have inside of the Russia three countries. Russian Rosatom, it is a nuclear Rosatom country. There are only 1% of the Russian population. We have government and president. It is another stakeholders and the Russian population. And when you say about the role of the Russian population not participated really in decision-making process, and this is a problem, and this is maybe main tragedy of the Russian people now, because I know that many Russian people don't like war, and they don't want to participate in this process, and they live like natural life in his dachas, in his families, and so I think when you said about the why did Russia wanted to be a part of the NATO, it was, as I remember, it was many years ago. Maybe it was just after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and it was very special time in Russian history, and it was not understandable for me.
Okay. Thank you. Let's go very quickly to Yuri Sheliazhenko with a couple of minutes. There was one question, a familiar one, Yuri, about isn't the peace conference in Switzerland a scam since Russia's not invited? I know you think it's better for people to talk about peace, even if it's not a peace negotiation. Another, people want sources for the statistics of death toll in Ukraine, if you have any, and we can share all your answers by email with everyone afterwards as well. But I thought the most interesting question was the one of numerous questions in the chat on this theme of, well, NATO is bad, NATO is awful, we agree, but so is Russia, and don't we need this horrible, barbaric, counterproductive force of NATO because of that other one called Russia? How do you respond, Yuri?
Okay, firstly, you're right. This peace summit in Switzerland, I am sure it could be a hope because we are talking about peace and it is a rare thing here in Ukraine, and it is also a rare thing in Russia. And unfortunately, in the world, people who are talking about peace sometimes are considered like not very close to reality, but sometimes people are gathering and they discussing peace, and we are talking about representatives of more than 100 countries, as well as some international organizations. It is great that NATO is very busy in preparing of this big summit of militarism and not participates in peace summit in Switzerland. So we, even if Russia, by the way, Russia which chose not to participate from the first days of when the summit was announced, Russia immediately condemned it. But interestingly, Putin managed to participate using instrument of megaphone diplomacy. He just before the summit said his position, his demands to Ukraine, and it was heard, and it will probably be reflected in discussions and final communique at this summit. There is such thing as shuttle diplomacy. It is like people are discussing some ideas how to find way forward to peace, and then not directly but through some intermediaries, good ideas could find the way to other side, and directly or indirectly considering current tensions are exclude many. Indeed, there is distrust between Kiev and Moscow, and this shuttle diplomacy and even megaphone diplomacy. It is a bad sign, but it is still diplomacy, and we should not talk in derogatory terms like fake summit, like not summit at all. It is peace summit, not ideal, but it is a step forward. Statistics. Talking about
Yuri, can we get people more answers by email following this, because we need to go back to Tamara for some more information before we leave.
To answer questions very quickly. Statistics. The best statistics you could find internationally verified statistics by OHCHR, Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights of United Nations. They publish statistics of losses from 2014 to 2022 and from 24th of February 2022 to current time after Russian invasion. Correct numbers are there, and I will provide links for it in chat. And last question. Of course, we don't need NATO or any military power to achieve peace. We need to learn how to talk instead of killing. We need to learn how to resist aggressions and tyrannies without waging wars, without militarism. It is a question of development of peace culture and peace education. So we need to expand civil society of the world, not military alliances, which on the contrary should be defunded and dissolved. NATO, collective security treaty organization, and any else military alliance or army just have no place in peaceful future of the world where everybody refuses to kill, and therefore wars will be abolished.
Very well said. Let's go back to Tamara.
Okay, I'm just going to quickly share my screen so I can let you know about some upcoming events and ways to get involved. And I'm just going to get this in full screen now. So a big thanks to all of our speakers. We need to stick together and build this movement to disband NATO and build global peace and cooperation. We have a few upcoming events and initiatives that you can participate in. The Global Women United for Peace Against NATO. Please check out their website, Women Against NATO. I've put their social media handles. It's a new X handle at No NATO Women. There's also the No to War, No to NATO network, a handle that you can follow there as well. We are calling for women to take pictures of themselves holding up a sign that has your country and says Women Against NATO, and you can include why you're opposed to NATO. And if you could get those pictures to us, the WILP US member Nancy T. Price 39@gmail.com, that would be fantastic. And check out our website for more information. Tomorrow, we are having a webinar about NATO's role in militarizing the Arctic and turning it into a theater for war. It's very much affecting my country in Canada, and we're going to have a great lineup of speakers from Sweden, Denmark, Norway, Russia, and the United States. So check out the notonato.org website to register and for more information. And then for those Canadians on the call, I wanted to let you know that the NATO Secretary General will be in our capital in Ottawa on Wednesday. There is a big rally that's going to be taking place at 3 o'clock outside the Prime Minister's office. We encourage you to take action, and wherever you are across the country, please have a sign, NATO's not welcome, no to NATO, and especially contact your member of parliament and say you want to withdraw from NATO. We also have a really important parliamentary petition where we're calling for Canada to withdraw and the alliance to be abolished, and for us to have a new Canadian foreign policy. And then finally, just a reminder to everyone on the call to please join us or support us on July 6th and 7th in Washington, D.C., where we're going to have our big summit, No to NATO, Yes to Peace and Cooperation. There will also be a rally. We urge you to do actions where you are and to speak out and amplify our message that NATO's time is up, 75 years is enough, and it is time for peace. So thank you again to David and World Beyond War team for organizing this webinar, all of our fantastic speakers, and all of you out there who participated in the call. Spread the word, and our webinar will be available on Facebook and on the YouTube channel and on the website. So thanks again. Have a great rest of your weekend. Bye.
Bye, everybody. Great job.